It's a pleasure to be here to present the results of our State of Transition Report 2024. Listening to the wonderful introductory comments by Susanna, by David and by Stephanie, my overriding thought is, gee, Simon, this better be good. Right? So let's get on with it. So I want to begin by just providing you with a bit of introduction to the report and to our methods, if you are not already familiar with them. And I also want to say at the very outset that this was very much the product of a lot of effort by a large team. So I get to take the glory this afternoon, but there's a lot of work by a large team standing behind this. So many of you will be familiar with this, but some of you might not. We assess companies according to two methods or approaches. One is we call management quality, and the other we call carbon performance. Management quality assesses companies' governance and management of greenhouse gas emissions and the risks and opportunities arising from the low carbon transition. And carbon performance, on the other hand, is a quantitative exercise in estimating companies' historical and current emissions, making a projection of their future emissions based on targets that they've set, and then comparing the resulting company pathway with a set of low-carbon benchmark scenarios for the sector in which that company operates, using the results from integrated assessment models of the economy and energy system. So if you want to think about it this way, management quality is an assessment of companies' inputs and their processes, and carbon performance is an assessment of companies' outcomes in terms of emissions, the thing that really matters for climate change. All of the company data that goes into this is based on public disclosures, and so our hope is that by putting together these two different data sets, we can build a comprehensive view of what companies are doing on climate change that is all both backward and forward-looking. As far as this report is concerned, as Susanna and David have already mentioned, this particular report covers slightly over 1,000 companies operating in 17 economic sectors, including pretty much all of the high-emitting sectors, and headquartered in 47 different countries. Now, our approach to company selection starts with prioritizing the high-emitting sectors like electricity, oil and gas, airlines, steel, and so on. Within each sector, we then select companies in descending order of market capitalization. And as you can see from the table, that means that with relatively few companies, you can already get large coverage of the market capitalization involved in the main high-emitting sectors. So we cover 100% or nearly 100% of market cap in the high-emitting sectors on management quality. Carbon performance is a more intensive exercise. For certain complicated companies, one carbon performance assessment can take days. And so for that reason, we analyse a smaller number of companies. We currently analyse slightly more than 400 companies on carbon performance, exclusively in the high-emitting sectors. And another issue with carbon performance is the availability of low-carbon scenarios. They are not available for all the sectors that one would want. So that's the coverage of companies in the report. What I want to do now is I want to present the results for management quality. Just as a reminder, this is our management quality framework. So we allocate companies on 6 levels based on 23 indicators. Each indicator you can think of as a management practice, and we use public disclosures to try to assess whether companies have implemented that management practice or not. The data for this come from our colleagues at FTSE Russell. What I particularly want to draw your attention to is the new level 5 that we've added to our management quality data set over the last year. The indicators on level 5 test for the extent to which companies are engaged in transition planning and the implementation of their transition. So the sorts of indicators on level 5 test for whether companies have quantified the key elements of their emissions reduction strategy, whether they've committed to aligning their capital expenditures with their targets, and whether they're clear on the role that offsets and negative emissions technologies will play in their transitions. These are the results applying our management quality framework to the slightly over 1,000 companies in our data set. And I particularly want to draw your attention to level 3 to start with. So you can see that most companies, 57%, now sit on level 3 of the framework. And if we were to convert management quality level into a continuous variable and just calculate the simple average, we would get 3.1. So in whichever way you measure it, 3.1 is what we now think of as a par score for companies in our management quality framework. And we have no qualms in saying that any company that is below level 3 is a laggard. Because after all, substantively, what you have to do to get to level 3 is acknowledge climate change as an issue, have a climate change policy in place, disclose your scope 1 and 2 emissions, and have some form of emissions reduction target in place. Can be qualitative. Those are not demanding criteria. That's what's required to get to level 3. If you're not on level 3 as a company, I think it would be fair to say you're a laggard. Many companies do more than the minimum requirement to get to level 3, and slightly over a quarter of companies are now on levels 4 or 5. Nonetheless, most companies are not. Only 10% of companies reach level 5. So already we have one expression of the corporate climate action gap, right? The difference between what we would expect companies to be doing on climate change and what they're actually doing. And no company in our data set satisfies all 23 indicators. What I'm now showing you is the management quality data on an indicator by indicator basis. There's a lot of information on this slide. But what I want you to do is just look at the general tendency for the blue bars to taper away as you go from top to bottom. That simply says that the indicators at the top are satisfied by almost all companies, and the indicators at the bottom are satisfied by almost no companies. Now, in one respect, that just says we've done our job properly. We've allocated our indicators correctly to the different levels. It should look like that, right? But if you look a little bit more closely at the data, then some substantively important points come out. The first one is that almost all companies, by this point, acknowledge climate change and have a policy commitment to act. And just jumping down to the bottom of the slide, as I've already alluded to, very few companies can currently demonstrate that they have detailed and actionable transition plans. Looking at the middle of the chart, what we're interested in are the outliers. The indicators on which a larger number of companies that expect to do well, and the indicators on which perhaps a smaller number of companies that expect to do well. Companies seem to do particularly well on setting targets, okay? And that is perhaps not a surprise. Companies also seem to do particularly well on having a process to manage climate-related risks. And these are large publicly listed companies. They do risk management. Again, we might think that's not surprising. So those are the indicators in the middle of the framework that companies do notably well on. There are also indicators in the middle of the framework, however, that companies do notably badly on. Companies struggle to convince on how they interact with public policy, in terms of whether they're committed to the aims of public policy on climate change, and how they ensure that their lobbying activities are aligned with public interest objectives. Okay. And another indicator on which companies do particularly badly is disclosure of material scope 3 emissions, for example, upstream and downstream in use and processing of sold products. My last slide on management quality looks at trends over successive rounds of TPI assessments. So for this, we have to use the old framework, which was level 0 to 4, because adding a level 5, in theory, makes it possible to score better, right? So we apply the old framework to all the companies, including our new companies. And essentially, what's the story that this slide tells is one of progress. Right? Average scores on management quality are going up. From year to year, more companies are moving up than are moving down, but progress is very slow. If we calculate the average management quality score in 2022 for the 563 companies that were assessed both in 22 and 23, the average score was 2.9, and in 2023 it was 3.0. So we're inching, creeping up on management quality. Another point to note is what happens to the new companies that are added. So it's not clear from this slide, but I can tell you that there's a systematic difference between the management quality score of companies that we're adding to high-emitting sectors and companies that we're adding to other sectors. And the reason for that is we already cover most of the companies in high-emitting sectors. So the companies we're adding to these sectors tend to be small or mid-cap. These companies are relatively weak on management quality, scoring on average 2.6. Companies that we're adding to other sectors, not high-emitting sectors, tend to be large-cap companies. These have a management quality score on average of 3.2. So this hints at a size effect on the data, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Now I want to show you the data for carbon performance. So here I'm showing you, out of the 409 companies that we've assessed in 11 high-emitting sectors, the shares of companies aligned with low carbon objectives on different time frames. So 2025, which is, we could call that the short term, or practically now. 2035, we tend to think about as the medium term, and 2050 as the long term. You can see a similar pattern across all the time frames. So most companies are not aligned with a 1.5 degrees or below 2 degrees scenario. Roughly speaking, 1/3 of companies is aligned with 1.5 degrees or below 2 degrees, and 2/3 of companies are not. With that 2/3 of companies being either aligned with a less ambitious national pledges scenario, not being aligned with any scenario, or not providing enough data for us to be able to assess them. So there's a fairly consistent story across the timeframes, but there is also some variation. In particular, you can see that 30% of companies are aligned with 1.5 degrees in 2050. This is the effect of net zero by 2050 pledges. So the movement to get companies to formulate net zero by 2050 targets is coming through in the data in terms of a relatively large share of companies aligned with 1.5 degrees in 2050. As far as 2025 is concerned, the short term, that's largely a function of companies' current business model and efforts that they've made in the last few years to reduce their emissions. For the medium term, what we find is that the low carbon benchmark scenarios tend to call for relatively rapid emissions reductions. And companies that have simply made a net zero by 2050 target or pledge are generally not doing enough to align in the medium term. So that's why alignment looks weakest, at least with respect to 1.5 degrees, in the medium term. This slide shows you trends in carbon performance. It's the first time we've actually looked at trends in carbon performance over the years. So I'm excited about the data that we're presenting in this slide. I'm actually also quite excited and pleased about the results in the sense that it shows strikingly a large increase in the share of companies that we assess that are aligned with 1.5 degrees. So normally you get misery from me when I'm presenting our data. But this is one sort of green shoot, to use that overused phrase. The number of companies that we assessed both in 2020 and 2023 that are aligned with 1.5 degrees has risen from 7% to 30%. To clarify, these are 2050 alignment data, but a similar pattern holds if we look at 2035 alignment data. So this isn't just a result that we see in the long run, we also see it in the medium term. Now, just moving back a slide, one of the questions that we frequently get asked is, well, okay, you've shown us data for 3 different time frames, but when does a company need to align? What is the year in which we should be asking our investee companies to align by? And the answer has always been, well, that's hard to say. There's no unambiguous scientific answer to that question. But for this report, we have, for the first time, assessed companies based on a metric which can help with this. This is the cumulative benchmark divergence metric introduced by Dan Gardner and colleagues at the Institutional Investor Group on climate change. This basically takes the area under the curve of a company's emissions pathway and compares it with the area under the curve of the low carbon benchmark scenario. If the area under the company's curve is larger than the area under the benchmark scenario's curve, the company exceeds its cumulative benchmark. It cumulatively emits more than its benchmark allows. If, on the other hand, the company cumulatively emits less than its benchmark, then it will have a negative, it will give a negative number on cumulative benchmark divergence. And this is helpful because you can see it for these 2 cases. These 2 companies have both set net zero by 2050 targets. They're both going to end up in the same place at 2050, but cumulatively, their positioning relative to their low carbon benchmarks is very different. Company A is always over, and cumulatively it's 34% over. Company B is always under, and it's cumulatively 41% under. So this measure helps us think about company performance across the whole time frame. And the logic of cumulation is solidly grounded in the science, because temperature change is linearly proportional to cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. So it has a basis in the science as well. Now, what cumulative benchmark divergence can also be helpful for is thinking about companies at the portfolio level. Because we can take cumulative benchmark divergence or CBD scores for individual companies, and we can allow good companies to offset bad companies in our portfolio, so that ultimately what we focus on is the CBD of the whole portfolio. And as an economist, I can. Okay. I will try to speak more. Not a problem I've usually had, but I will try to speak more loudly. So at the portfolio level, we can let companies with negative CBD compensate for companies with positive CBD. And that means that we can transition our portfolios to net zero more cost effectively. And it also means that we're not cutting across public policy instruments, market-based instruments like the EU emissions trading system, which are based on this principle that more able companies reduce their emissions faster than less able companies. So we don't impose a one-size-fits-all solution on individual companies. So what we do is we take this CBD method and we're going to compute CBD for all the TPI companies for which we have data, which is about 300. And when we do that, we find that all but one of our sectors has a positive cumulative benchmark divergence. In other words, is emitting too much cumulatively. And if we add all these sectors up, weighted by market capitalization, then we find that our universe of TPI companies is emitting 61% more cumulatively than it is allowed to do in order to stay below 1.5 degrees. So here is another measure of the corporate climate action gap, a measure based on our carbon performance data, a measure that allows for companies to compensate each other, and a measure which is sensitive to the whole timeline. I'm going to finish my talk by making a few further remarks about management quality and carbon performance. So earlier I alluded to the fact that size appears to matter, that large companies appear to do better on management quality. Well, we systematically collect data on not only company size, but also company sector and the region in which a company is headquartered. And so what we're doing here is we're testing whether size, sector, and region matter after controlling for each of these factors. In other words, if we see a size effect, how do we know that's a size effect and not a region effect or a sector effect, and vice versa? This turns out to be a somewhat complicated statistical exercise. You basically have to run a lot of regressions, and you have to, because we're dealing with categorical variables, you have to pick a reference category for each of the things that you're interested in. This chart is our attempt to simplify all that into something that you can understand. And basically it says that all three things matter. Size matters, sector matters, region matters. So certain sectors perform better on management quality and carbon performance than others after controlling for size and region. In particular, sectors like electricity perform well, and sectors like oil and gas perform badly, at least on carbon performance. That's what you can see here. Company size matters after controlling for sector and region. Large cap companies have better management quality and better carbon performance than small and mid-cap companies. And the region of headquartering matters after controlling for sector and size. Companies, particularly in Europe, do well on management quality and carbon performance. Companies in emerging markets tend to do less well. The last thing I want to talk about is the relationship between management quality and carbon performance. So how do these two measures relate? Well, the first thing we look at in the report is whether management quality predicts realized carbon performance in the sense of real emissions reductions happening in the few years, in the following few years. So you may or may not remember this, but in our last State of Transition report, we looked at whether companies with better management quality in 2017 reduced their emissions more between 2017 and 2019. And we found that they did. And this is important because it suggests that if you, as someone engaging a company, can persuade a company to adopt more management and governance practices, that will in turn deliver more emissions reductions. That's why this is an important thing to ask. And we found in our last report some tentative evidence for that. For this report, we repeat that analysis, but looking at the longer period from 2017 to 2021. And we find that, again, yes, companies who in 2017 had higher management quality went on to reduce their emissions more. The problem is there were only about 72 companies in the TPI database in 2017. So that result comes from looking at only 72 companies. We would clearly like to have a larger sample. So the next thing we did is we repeated the analysis for companies' management quality in 2018, looking at their subsequent emissions reductions to 2021. If we do that, we have a bigger sample, 150 companies, 151 to be precise. We have a slightly shorter period over which we're looking at emissions reductions. That's not so good. And for that analysis, we don't find any relationship between management quality and carbon performance. Okay. Companies with higher management quality in 2018 did not reduce their emissions more between 2018 and 2021. Separately, a study by our colleagues at FTSE Russell covering more than 2,000 companies on management quality found a positive association between management quality in 2019 and emissions reductions between 2019 and 2022. Now that is a very large sample of companies, which is good. But on the other hand, because of data limitations, that study had to restrict itself to scope 1 and 2 emissions only. And it's also unclear whether the differences were statistically significant. So looking at all the evidence that we've been able to put together on whether management quality predicts emissions reductions in the near term, we can't yet talk about a robust and statistically significant relationship. What we can say, I think, is that there are tentative signs that if a company implements more management and governance practices related to climate change, it will reduce its emissions more, its realized emissions, over the coming years. The next thing we do is we look at the relationship between management quality and carbon performance in the medium and the long run. So these are not realized emissions reductions anymore. This is using our medium and long run carbon performance data, which talk about targeted emissions reductions. Here the story is simple. I don't need to go on for many minutes about this. There is clearly a relationship. Companies with higher management quality are both better at disclosure of carbon emissions, partly by definition, and they also set more ambitious emissions reductions targets for the medium and long-term future. So that tells you that if you can persuade a company to adopt more management and governance practices on climate change, it will tend to set more ambitious medium and long-run emissions reduction targets. That's what that says. That seems clear. The last thing we want to do is we want to look at this relationship between management quality and carbon performance at the indicator level. Now, there are 23 indicators. So this means that there are far too many ways to look at the data, and you need to take a more sophisticated approach to this. So for this, we use the machine learning technique called clustering in order to try to see which management quality practices seem to be particularly associated with high-achieving companies on carbon performance. So the companies that have set the most ambitious emissions reduction targets, which particular management practices have they adopted that other companies have not adopted? When we do this, we identify 3 clusters of companies: high-achieving companies, moderate-achieving companies, and low-achieving companies. These are companies that do well, moderately well, or badly on both management quality and carbon performance. That in itself is not interesting. That's just the properties of the 3 clusters that the analysis produces. What is interesting to my mind is to look at the difference between high-achieving and moderate-achieving companies at the indicator level and say, well, which indicators is it that the high-achieving companies are satisfying that other companies are not satisfying? And a few indicators particularly come out of this analysis. Most of all are indicator number 18, which asks, does the company disclose the actions necessary to meet its emissions reduction targets? To some extent, also the indicators quantifying or looking for quantification of key emissions reduction elements, committing alignment of future capex, and committing to ensure that lobbying is consistent with climate policy. Okay. I would summarize the results of this analysis with the statement in the title of the slide. High-achieving companies are both ambitious in the targets they set and clear on the actions that are necessary to meet them. That's essentially the outcome of this analysis in one statement. Okay, let me finish up with a few summary remarks. I mean, quite simply, progress is being made, right? But slowly. And there remains a corporate climate action gap. And I've provided you with some measures of that, both in terms of management quality and carbon performance. On management quality, level 3 functions as the new PAR score. Any company below that can be considered a laggard. But on the other hand, since most companies are only on level 3, there's clearly still a lot more that companies could be doing on management and governance of climate change before they could claim to be aligned with best practice in terms of transition planning and implementation. On carbon performance, the good news is that we see quite a striking increase in the number of companies with long-run goals that align with 1.5 degrees. However, the problem is, firstly, still the majority of companies are not. And even those companies that are aligned with 1.5 degrees in 2050 often aren't aligned in the short or medium term. And that shows up when we compute their cumulative benchmark divergence. Our universe of companies will emit 61% more on an intensity basis than they are permitted to do so on a 1.5 degrees scenario. Lastly, in terms of the links between the two types of data, there's tentative evidence that management quality is positively associated with subsequent realized short-term emissions reductions. There is solid evidence that management quality is positively associated with having ambitious emissions reduction targets for the medium and long run. And if we look at the data on quite a granular level in terms of specific indicators, we identify that the highest achieving companies do not only have ambitious targets, but they're also more likely to disclose and quantify the actions necessary to meet those targets. And they're also more likely to align their future capital expenditures with their targets. So that is just about it for me. I'm going to just finish off by giving you a little window on what to look forward to in the next few months. So what I've presented to you today is our management quality and carbon performance data. They also go into the CA 100+ disclosure framework. We currently assess just a bit over 1,000 companies. We're going to double that coverage in the next few months. On carbon performance, we're going to go from 410 or so companies to at least 550. And what you can also see on the slide here is our plans for our banking data set and for our sovereigns data set, where we have reports coming up in the next few months and big expansions of the number of companies we cover.